Welcome to Lesson 18, Quantitative Evaluation 2. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to describe the DECIDE framework and why it is useful, write questions for a user study based on study goals, and recommend metrics for usability and user experience. Last time, we talked about the scientific method and how you might design an experiment. But how do we actually go and set up an experiment and run it? There are a lot of decisions to make, so it's important that you decide how to do that. The DECIDE framework involves determining the goals, exploring the questions, choosing the evaluation approach and methods, identifying the practical issues, deciding how to deal with ethical issues, and evaluating, analyzing, interpreting, and presenting the data. Some of this might be familiar from the experimental method, but this allows you to think about this as a whole. When you're doing a user study, often the biggest push is just to get that first pilot done, handling all the small little details, and to get your first actual participant done. And this framework helps you get there. So, D, determine the goals. What are the high-level goals of the evaluation? Who wants what information and why? These goals will help influence the approach and should be grounded in your task-based analysis and your potential design solutions. So all the work that you've done in your user-centered or task-centered design up till now will help give that context. Make sure that your study is aligned with what your goals are and what the system's goals are. Examples might include identifying the best metaphor on which to base the design, checking to ensure that the final interface is consistent, remember our interaction design principles, investigate how technology affects working practices, or improving usability of an existing product, which is what we focused on in our last lesson. E is explore the questions. All evaluations need goals and questions to guide them. So from your goals, what questions do you want to ask and answer? For example, the goal of finding out why many customers prefer to purchase paper airline tickets rather than e-tickets can be broken down into sub-questions. What are customers' attitudes to these new tickets? Are they concerned about security? Is the interface for obtaining them poor? This particular example doesn't scale well both to modern airline purchase practices and the current airline industry's troubles. But we are able to think about how this might frame how you'd explore these questions from your goals. You then move to C, choose the approach and methods, which we talked about a bit more in length last time. The evaluation approach influences the methods used, and in turn, how data is collected, analyzed, and presented, as we've already discussed, both in quantitative methods and with our qualitative methods before that. So for example, field studies typically involve observations and interviews. They do not involve control tests in a laboratory, and they produce qualitative data, which you analyze with different methods than you might with for a quantitative study. Then you identify practical issues. No study is perfect. You're always trying to deal with the messy real world. So you have to trade off constraints and make a million decisions. For example, selecting your participants. We talked about inclusion and exclusion criteria there. Staying on budget. What can you afford to do? Can you afford to have 20, 30, 100, 2,000 participants? How long do you have to do this? So you have to stay in schedule. Finding evaluators, who's going to evaluate your system if you're doing something like a heuristic evaluation, which we'll cover later. And selecting equipment. What are you actually going to set up in your apparatus? Then you want to decide about ethical issues. You want to develop an informed consent form. Participants have the right to know the goals of the study, know what will happen to the findings, know about privacy of your personal information. Where are you storing the data? What are you doing with it? What are you revealing to other people? They have the right to leave when they wish, so they can stop at any time because they're there as a guest helping you out. So you want to make sure they know that they're volunteering their time, even if you're providing remuneration. And to be treated politely and with respect. This should go without saying, but sometimes you need to go that extra level to make sure people feel safe and secure when interacting with the system, depending on the population and depending on the interface. In research, we follow the TCPS. There's a whole tutorial for how you might do this, which is required of everyone who works in my lab. And I would recommend at least looking at the TCPS as you go ahead with your next assignment and milestone, just to understand some of the ethical principles at play here and some of the goals that we have when trying to treat people ethically and design studies that respect people. Then you evaluate, interpret, and present your findings. The approach and methods used influence how data is evaluated, interpreted, and presented. The following need to be considered. Reliability. Can the study be replicated? Is the study reported in enough detail for someone to understand what you did and recreate it? Validity. Is it measuring what you expected? Or are you measuring something that's not aligned to is the measure not agreeing with the question, and is that agreeing with the goal, etc. Biases. Is the process creating biases? Are you doing a convenience sample on a corner and just collecting people from a certain socioeconomic status, everyone that is a student, everyone's the same age, etc.? You don't want to have a very specific population, especially if you're assuming you're collecting a diverse or representative sample of the population you're trying to support. Scope. Can the findings be generalized? Are you doing a very, very specific study for a particular variation in a single interface, like an A/B test for a major online web app? Or are you trying to find something a little more fundamental that then translates across different interfaces and systems? And ecological validity. Is the environment influencing things? So the Hawthorne observer effect, the fact that you're there watching them, is that going to change how they behave? And if it is, you might need to structure some sort of a study that allows you to observe them without being noticed. But then you have to have ethical issues addressed. So are you telling people about this? Are you revealing things after the fact? Do you get consent later? All of these things are really tricky, and you need to start to compare all of them. So you have to make sure that you decide. Determine the goals, explore the questions, choose the evaluation approach and methods that are appropriate for your goals and questions. Identify the practical issues. There will be a million of them, and you need to solve each one of them to get to that point where you're running your first pilot and running your first participant. And decide how to deal with ethical issues. Knowing sources, reviewing sources like the TCPS will really help you there. Finally, you have to evaluate, analyze, interpret, and present the data in a way that is true to answering the questions that you have, achieving the goals you want, but still respectful to the participants, and handling all the ethical and practical issues that you had to solve along the way. The key point: there are a lot of issues to consider before conducting an evaluation study, and the DECIDE framework is one useful checklist for planning the study. Let's test this out with the goal of improving the user experience of a website. And we're going to talk here about UX metrics, which is a fairly common one that you're going to want to use in your studies. Common metrics are time, error completion rate, which are typically usability metrics. But how do you measure user experience? Well, let's start by having a your turn. Pick a website you're familiar with and complete the short User Experience Questionnaire, UEQ, which you can try out at this website. Take no more than 5 minutes, just do this quickly, and upload a screenshot as per the instructions on Learn. Go ahead.